There are certain cases in the long career of Sherlock Holmes which remain in my memory with a peculiar clarity. Some are remembered because of their danger, others because of the strange people whom we encountered, or because of the cleverness of the problem itself. But there was one case which I kept hidden for many years. It was not because I have forgotten it, quite the opposite. I remembered it so well that I was reluctant to place it before the public. There were people involved whose names carried weight, and there were matters of a private and delicate nature which seemed better left undisturbed. At last, however, Holmes gave me permission to tell the story. It began on the 3rd of September. Wanfas and I had always enjoyed the Turkish baths. There was something about the quiet warmth of the drawing room that seemed to soften even my friend's usually guarded manner. With the noise of London held at a distance and the air filled with gentle warmth, Holmes sometimes became more willing to speak of his affairs. On that particular morning we were resting side by side in a quiet corner of the establishment in Northumberland Avenue. I had asked him whether anything of interest was happening in the world of crime. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached lazily toward the coat hanging nearby and drew out an envelope. It had arrived from the Carlton Club. The message was brief. Sir James Damery intended to visit Holmes at 4:30 on the following afternoon. The matter, he had written, was both delicate and important, and he hoped that Holmes would make every effort to receive him. Holmes had already confirmed the appointment. The name of Sir James Damery was well known in London society. He was a man who had often been called upon when some difficult matter required diplomacy rather than publicity. He had a reputation for quietly arranging affairs which wealthy and influential people preferred not to see discussed in newspapers. Holmes knew something of his earlier work, and therefore regarded the invitation with interest. He also told me, and whatever the business might be, he expected that I should accompany him. I was pleased, naturally. At the appointed hour on the following day, I arrived at Baker Street. The familiar rooms looked much as they had during so many earlier adventures. The fire was comfortable, the familiar chairs stood in their usual places, and Holmes was seated with that calm appearance which so often concealed intense thought. Precisely at 4:30, Sir James Damery was announced. He was an imposing man. His broad face was clean-shaven, his expression open and friendly, and his gray eyes carried the frankness of someone accustomed to dealing with people directly. His clothing was immaculate, from his dark frock coat to the carefully chosen details of his cravat and shoes. Even before he had spoken more than a few words, I understood why he possessed such influence in society. Yet, beneath his pleasant appearance, there was an unusual seriousness. He had not come merely to ask Holmes to investigate some ordinary matter. His concern was connected with a man whom he described as exceptionally dangerous. Holmes had heard similar descriptions before. Over the years, criminals of considerable ability had crossed his path. Moriarty and Colonel Sebastian Morin had both possessed reputations which could reasonably be called formidable. But Sir James was speaking of another man. His name was Baron Adelbert Gruner. Holmes knew the name immediately. Gruner was an Austrian whose past contained a notorious tragedy. His first wife had died in circumstances which had officially been treated as an accident in the Splugen Pass, yet Holmes had never believed that explanation. There had also been a suspicious death connected with the case, and a technical weakness in the evidence had allowed Gruner to escape punishment. To Holmes, however, the matter had always been clear. He believed the Baron had murdered his wife, and now the man was living in England. Sir James explained that the old crime was not the immediate reason for his visit. something much more serious was approaching. There was a young woman named Violet de Merville. She was the daughter of General de Merville, a distinguished soldier whose name was well known. Violet was young, wealthy, beautiful, intelligent, and highly accomplished, yet she had fallen completely under the influence of Baron Gruner. The two had met during a Mediterranean yachting voyage. Gruner had attached himself to the young woman and gradually won her affection. By the time her family understood what was happening, it was too late. Violet was deeply in love with him. Indeed, according to Sir James, the feeling had become an obsession. She would listen to nothing against the man she intended to marry. Her wedding to Gruner was expected to take place within a month. The situation was especially troubling because Violet was an adult woman with a strong will of her own. Her father could not simply command her to abandon the relationship. The family had already attempted to tell her about Gruner's past. It had achieved almost nothing. The Baron had anticipated such attacks. He had apparently told Violet about the scandals surrounding his earlier life, but had presented himself as the innocent victim of malicious enemies. He had prepared her to distrust anyone who might attempt to expose him. Thus, the truth itself had become almost useless. Violet believed Gruner. She loved him, and she was determined to marry him. There was another mystery, however. Sir James was not acting directly for General de Merville. The general, once a powerful soldier, had been emotionally broken by the situation. The man who had faced danger without fear on battlefields was now unable to resist the influence of the clever Austrian. Instead, Sir James represented another person, an old friend of the general. This unknown client had known Violet since she was a child and had developed a deep paternal affection for her. He could not stand by and watch what he believed would become a terrible tragedy. Yet he insisted upon remaining anonymous. Holmes was immediately uncomfortable with this arrangement. He could tolerate mystery surrounding a case, but he disliked having mystery at both ends. He knew the name of the man he was expected to oppose, but not the identity of the person employing him. For a moment, he considered refusing. Sir James was clearly disappointed. He explained that the unknown client had honorable motives and wished only to save Violet. He also assured Holmes that he would have complete freedom to investigate the matter. Holmes eventually agreed. He promised not to uncover the client's identity. The information continued. Baron Gruner lived at Vernon Lodge near Kingston. He was wealthy, having made money through questionable financial dealings. He possessed expensive tastes and was particularly interested in horses, art, books, and Chinese pottery. This last detail caught Holmes's attention. The Baron was regarded as an authority on Chinese ceramics and had even written a book on the subject. Holmes made a quiet note of it. It was one of those small observations which, at the time, seemed almost unimportant. I had learned long ago, however, not to judge the importance of a detail merely by the attention Holmes appeared to give it. Sir James then left us. For several moments Holmes remained seated in thought. The room became quiet again. Outside, London continued with its ordinary business. Carriages moved along Baker Street, footsteps passed upon the pavement, and the distant sounds of the city came and went through the windows. Eventually, Holmes turned his attention to me. I suggested that we should speak directly to Violet herself. Holmes agreed that it might eventually become necessary, but he doubted that a stranger could succeed where her own father had failed. Instead, he thought of another possibility. His name was Shinwell Johnson. I had rarely written about Johnson in my earlier accounts of Holmes's career, largely because his most useful work came during the later years. Johnson had once been a dangerous criminal himself. He had served 2 terms at Parkhurst Before finally changing his life, Holmes had found a way to make use of his unusual knowledge. Johnson had become an unofficial agent within London's criminal underworld. Because of his former reputation, he could enter places where an ordinary police informant would have attracted suspicion. Nightclubs, gambling houses, cheap lodging establishments, and other darker corners of London were open to him. He could listen without appearing to listen. He could ask questions without seeming to investigate, and information gathered in those places often reached Holmes before it reached Scotland Yard. That evening, I had pressing professional business of my own, so I did not accompany Holmes during his first movements. We met later at Simpson's in the Strand. Through the restaurant windows, I could see the busy stream of London passing outside. The evening traffic moved steadily beneath the lamps, while the great city seemed to carry on without any knowledge of the private danger gathering around one young woman. Holmes told me that Johnson was already searching for information. The task was not to prove the old murder that was already known to Holmes. The problem was to find something that could reach Violet, something she could not dismiss as another malicious story. Holmes believed that the human heart was a strange thing. A terrible crime might sometimes be explained away, while a smaller and more personal revelation could destroy an illusion which seemed unbreakable. He had therefore decided to meet Baron Gruner himself. There was no hesitation in Holmes when he made that decision. He wanted to see the man directly. He wanted to observe him at close range. And so, without waiting for Johnson's investigations to produce their results, Holmes traveled to Kingston. Baron Gruner received him. The meeting was remarkable. Gruner was perfectly calm. He was not surprised that Holmes had come. Indeed, he appeared to have expected it. The Baron was handsome, well-dressed, and possessed of polished manners. His voice was gentle, and his manner almost soothing, yet Holmes sensed something beneath that pleasant surface. It was not merely confidence, it was danger. Gruner had the outward appearance of an educated gentleman. His interests in art, books, forces, and Chinese pottery gave him the appearance of refinement, but Holmes saw something colder beneath it. The Baron already knew why Holmes had come. He understood that the detective intended to prevent his marriage to Violet, and rather than becoming angry, he treated the matter almost as a private amusement. He believed Holmes had little chance of success. The Baron had already prepared Violet to distrust anyone who attacked his character. He had told her about his past in advance, and had presented every scandal as the work of enemies. Holmes attempted to persuade him that the marriage would bring trouble. If Gruner abandoned Violet, the matter might end quietly. If he continued, powerful enemies would pursue him. The Baron, however, was completely unmoved. He believed that Violet's devotion to him was absolute. He had told her everything he considered necessary about his past, while carefully controlling the way in which she understood it. He even boasted of the influence he possessed over her mind. Holmes soon realized that ordinary warnings would achieve nothing. The meeting ended with a warning of another kind. Gruner referred to a French agent named Lebrun, who had previously investigated him. Lebrun had later been attacked and permanently injured in Paris. The implication was unmistakable. Gruner was telling Holmes that people who interfered with him could suffer. Holmes returned to me with a clear assessment. The Baron was not a man who merely made threats. He was dangerous precisely because he did not need to make many of them. By then, Johnson had returned with someone who might provide the missing piece. Her name was Kitty Winter. She had once been closely involved with Gruner. Her life had been badly damaged by him, and she carried an intense hatred toward the Baron. Unlike Violet, Kitty knew the man behind the polished exterior. She had seen his cruelty. She had experienced his manipulation. And most importantly, she possessed information which might finally, if Holmes, a weapon. She told us that Gruner kept a private book. It was bound in brown leather, secured with a lock, and decorated with his arms in gold. Inside were records of the women whose lives he had damaged. There were photographs, names, and details. It was not simply a diary. It was a private record of conquest, a catalogue of ruined lives. Kitty remembered seeing it more than a year earlier. She believed that Gruner had kept it in the inner study of his house, inside an old bureau. Holmes had already seen the outer study. He knew it contained the Baron's famous collection of Chinese pottery. Behind the desk was another door leading into the smaller inner study, where papers and private possessions were kept. The information immediately changed the shape of the case. For the first time, Holmes had something which might reach Violet, but obtaining the book would be difficult. Gruner was careful. At night, his house was protected by an alarm. A burglary would be dangerous and unlikely to succeed. Holmes, therefore, needed another opportunity. As we sat that evening, with the London traffic moving quietly beyond the windows, I could see that his mind was already working. He had found the possible key. Now he needed a way to reach it. Little did I know that the most dangerous part of the case was already beginning to take shape. The next evening, Holmes and I met again. Johnson was absent. Kitty Winter had been asked to return later. For the moment, Holmes was considering whether she should meet Violet personally. It seemed the desperate idea. Yet there were moments when even the most carefully constructed plan depended upon an unpredictable human reaction. Violet might refuse to believe Holmes. She might dismiss Kitty. She might reject every piece of evidence placed before her, but perhaps there was still one fact which could penetrate the wall Gruner had built around her. Holmes had not yet discovered what that fact would be, and somewhere in the quiet rooms of Vernon Lodge, the brown leather book remained hidden. For the moment, the Baron believed himself secure. He had wealth, he had influence, he had Violet's devotion, and he believed that Sherlock Holmes possessed no weapon capable of breaking that devotion. He was soon to discover that Holmes had begun looking in a very different direction. If you enjoy these quiet recollections of our adventures, you are always welcome to join me again for another Sherlock Holmes case. The evening settled gently over London as Holmes continued to consider his next move. I remember the quiet confidence in his manner. He did not appear hurried. But I had known him long enough to understand that when Holmes became this still, his mind was often moving faster than anyone around him could imagine. And so our strange case continued, with Violet de Merville still devoted to the man she loved, Baron Gruner still confident in his victory, and one locked book waiting somewhere beyond our reach. For the moment, that was all we knew, but it would not remain so for long. The following evening, Holmes and I met once more at our quiet restaurant in the Strand. By then, he had already arranged the meeting at which he had hoped might provide another opening. General de Merville had agreed to receive us, and his daughter had consented to see Holmes. It was not an encouraging beginning. Violet de Merville had agreed only because of her father's wishes. In every other matter connected with her marriage, she remained completely opposed to him. Holmes understood this perfectly. He also understood that the Baron had prepared her for the meeting. Gruner knew that sooner or later Holmes would try to reach her. He had therefore filled her mind with his own version of events. Anyone who came forward against him could be dismissed as jealous, malicious, or dishonest. Still, Holmes intended to make the attempt. The next afternoon, a cab carried him to Berkeley Square. Miss Winter accompanied him, and together they entered the large London residence of General de Merville. I was not present during that meeting. Holmes later described it to me in detail, and I have often wondered whether I would have found the scene easier to understand had I witnessed it myself. The General's house was one of those great grey London buildings which seemed almost too severe for domestic life. Its rooms were spacious and formal, with high ceilings and heavy furnishings. Everything suggested wealth, age, and military dignity. In one of those rooms, Holmes found Violet waiting. She was young, beautiful, and remarkably composed. There was something almost unreal about her appearance. Holmes told me that she reminded him of the serene figures in old religious paintings, with a pale and distant beauty that seemed to belong to another world. Yet beneath that calm appearance was a will of extraordinary strength. She already knew why Holmes had come. The Baron had made certain of that. He had warned her that people would attempt to turn her against him. He had taught her what to expect, and in doing so, had taken away much of the power which truth might otherwise have possessed. Holmes tried another approach. He did not begin with the details of the Austrian tragedy. He spoke instead of marriage and of the terrible possibility that a young woman might discover the true nature of her husband only after it was too late. He tried to make Violet imagine what life might become once the excitement of courtship had ended. He spoke of fear, regret, humiliation, and the helplessness of discovering too late that the person beside her was not the man she had believed him to be. It was one of the rare occasions when I heard that Holmes had appealed almost entirely to emotion. Usually he trusted facts. Usually he preferred evidence, logic, and careful deduction. But there are moments when reason cannot easily penetrate a heart already occupied by devotion, and Violet's heart belonged completely to Gruner. She listened patiently. She did not become angry. She did not even seem particularly troubled. Instead, she calmly explained that she already knew about the accusations against her fiancé. This was precisely what Holmes had feared. Gruner had not attempted to hide his past from her. He had simply told the story in a way which made himself appear to be the victim. Every accusation had become evidence of someone else's hatred. Every scandal had been transformed into an injustice, and Violet had accepted his explanation. She believed that she alone understood him. She believed that she alone understood him. She believed that she alone understood him. Most importantly, she believed that her love could somehow redeem him. Holmes found himself facing something more difficult than ignorance. He was facing conviction. The more he spoke, the more firmly she appeared to close her mind. She had already decided what Holmes represented. To her, he was simply another person attempting to destroy the man she loved. At this point, Miss Winter intervened. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Holmes had been calm and patient. Kitty Winter was neither. She had lived through Gruner's influence herself. She knew what his charm meant when it was directed at someone who trusted him. She knew how easily kindness could become manipulation, and how quickly fascination could become suffering. She looked at Violet and saw not a romantic rival, but another woman standing at the beginning of the road she herself had traveled. Her warning was direct. She told Violet that Gruner had used women before. He had drawn them close, gained their trust, and then discarded them. She told her that the same fate could await her, but Violet remained unmoved. She regarded Kitty's testimony as the bitter words of a former mistress. She had already been told that such women might come forward. The Baron had prepared her for precisely this kind of attack. Kitty became more and more distressed. To her, Violet's calmness was almost unbearable. She had expected at least some sign of doubt. Instead, the young woman remained distant and controlled. She accepted that Gruner had behaved badly in the past. She accepted that he had been involved with other women. She even accepted that there had been serious accusations against him. But she believed he had repented. She believed he loved her. And she believed that her own influence could bring out the better side of his nature. That belief was stronger than any warning Holmes could offer. I have often thought about this part of the case. There are forms of danger against which knowledge gives no protection. A person may know that a bridge is unsafe and still cross it. A person may be shown the evidence of a deception and still choose to believe the deceiver. Love, when joined to idealism, can sometimes create a wall stronger than ignorance. Holmes encountered that wall in Violet de Merville. The meeting ended badly. Kitty's anger finally overcame her restraint, and Holmes had to prevent the situation from becoming a physical struggle. He brought the interview to an end and removed Kitty from the house. Outside, the London air felt cool and damp. The streets of Berkeley Square were already settling into evening. Lamps were beginning to glow, and the wheels of passing carriages moved steadily over the pavement. T was still furious. Holmes, however, was quiet. The plan had failed. The one person who most needed to understand the truth had rejected it, and yet Holmes did not regard the failure as the end. He knew that Gruner's confidence was dangerous. He also knew that the Baron had something to protect. The locked book remained in the background of his thoughts, but at that moment there was no easy way to obtain it. Holmes could not simply break into Vernon's lodge. He could not rely upon Violet, and he could not force Gruner to reveal anything. For a short time it seemed that the Baron had won. 2 days later, however, the situation changed completely. I remember exactly where I was when I saw the newspaper. I had been walking between the Grand Hotel and Charing Cross Station. Evening had come, and the streets were busy with the usual movement of London. A one-legged news vendor stood with his papers displayed before him. Among the headlines was one which immediately caught my eye. It concerned Sherlock Holmes. The words were alarming. There had been a murderous attack upon him. For a moment I could hardly understand what I was reading. The report stated that Holmes had been attacked in Regent Street near the Café Royal. 2 men had assaulted him with heavy sticks. He had suffered serious injuries to his head and body and had been taken first to hospital before insisting upon being brought back to Baker Street. The attackers had escaped. The newspaper suggested that they were probably connected with the criminal world and had acted because of Holmes's long activity against them. I needed no further explanation. My first thought was the Baron. I immediately hired a hansom and hurried to Baker Street. When I arrived, I found the famous surgeon, Sir Leslie Oakshott, there. His carriage was waiting outside. He gave me the news I desperately needed. Holmes was not in immediate danger. He had suffered 2 deep wounds to the scalp and considerable bruising. Several stitches had been required, and morphine had been administered. Rest was essential, but Holmes was alive. I entered his room. The blinds were partly lowered, leaving the chamber in a subdued light. A narrow beam of sunlight touched the white bandages around his head. There was blood upon the dressing, yet his eyes were open. Even injured, Holmes was watching. He immediately tried to reassure me. His injuries, he told me, were not nearly as severe as the newspaper suggested. Then, in his usual fashion, he began explaining what had happened. The attackers had been armed with sticks. Holmes had managed to protect himself against most of the blows, but the second attacker had found his opportunity. The assault had been carefully arranged. The men had escaped with remarkable efficiency. Holmes had no doubt that they had been sent by someone who understood his methods and wanted him frightened, injured, or removed from the case. But there was another reason for the attack. Holmes wanted the newspapers to believe that his condition was much worse than it really was. He intended to encourage reports of severe concussion, delirium, and even the possibility that he might not survive. The idea was simple. If Gruner believed Holmes was helpless, the Baron might relax his precautions. The attack itself had therefore given Holmes something useful. It had created an opportunity. I was to help him maintain the illusion. If anyone asked about his condition, I was to describe it as grave. Holmes knew that information would travel. The Baron would hear of it. And if Gruner believed his most dangerous enemy had been badly weakened, he might become careless. There was another matter which Holmes considered more urgent. Kitty Winter had been involved in the investigation. The men who had attacked Holmes might therefore consider her a danger as well. Holmes feared that Gruner's people would attempt to silence her. I left Baker Street that evening, with instructions to find Shinwell Johnson. Before the night was over, Kitty had been moved to a quiet suburb where she could remain hidden. For the next 6 days, London believed that Sherlock Holmes was close to death. The newspapers carried serious reports. Each day seemed to bring another alarming detail. There were rumors of complications. There were suggestions that his injuries might prove fatal. The public believed the great detective was fighting for his life. That I knew better. I visited Baker Street regularly. Holmes was recovering. His constitution was remarkably strong, and his determination was stronger still. Even so, I could not always tell what he was planning. That was one of the peculiar difficulties of being Sherlock Holmes's closest friend. I might be sitting beside him in the same room, and still understand only a small part of what was passing through his mind. He had always believed that the safest planner was the man who worked alone. During this case, that habit became especially pronounced. I trusted him completely, but I was also aware of the distance between what Holmes knew and what he allowed me to know. For 6 days, therefore, the strange drama continued. The newspapers mourned a detective who was not dying. Gruner believed his enemy had been severely weakened. Kitty remained hidden. And Violet de Merville continued preparing to marry the man whom Holmes believed to be murderer. Then, on the 7th day, the situation became urgent. The stitches were removed from Holmes's wounds. He was recovering well. Yet the newspapers continued to report complications, helping to preserve the illusion of serious illness. That same evening, another piece of news appeared. It concerned Baron Gruner. He was planning to leave England aboard Cunard liner Ruritania. The ship was due to leave Liverpool on Friday. Gruner claimed to have important financial business to settle in America before returning for his wedding to Violet. Holmes listened carefully when I told him. The date was everything. Friday was only 3 days away. If Gruner sailed, the situation would become far more difficult. Holmes believed the Baron might be attempting to place himself beyond the reach of his enemies. But Holmes was not prepared to let him go. He had only a short time. For several moments he sat quietly in his chair, his bandaged head resting against his hand. Then he gave me an instruction which seemed completely unrelated to the case. He wanted me to spend the next 24 hours studying Chinese pottery. I admit that I was puzzled. After all that had happened, I had expected some urgent investigation into Gruner, his movements, or his financial affairs. Instead, Holmes wanted me to become an expert in ceramics. I did not argue. Long experience had taught me that when Holmes gave an apparently absurd instruction, there was usually a very precise reason behind it. I went to the London Library in St. James's Square. There I found a substantial volume on Chinese ceramics, began my unusual study. For hours I read. I memorized names, periods, marks, styles, and dates. I learned about the great Chinese dynasties and the artists associated with them. I studied the marks of the Ming period, the work by the earlier Sung and Yuan periods, and the traditions surrounding the great collections of the East. It was not knowledge which I expected to use in the ordinary course of my medical life, yet I understood that Holmes had chosen it for a reason. The strange subject gradually became the center of my thoughts. By the following evening, I had spent almost all my waking hours studying porcelain. When I returned to Baker Street, Holmes was out of bed. The newspapers would have led the public to believe that he was still dangerously ill. In reality, he sat quietly in his favorite chair. His head was still heavily bandaged, but his eyes were bright. He listened as I reported my progress. Then he revealed the purpose of my strange assignment. From a small box on the mantelpiece, he produced an object carefully wrapped in fine Eastern silk. When he unfolded the cloth, I saw a delicate little saucer of deep blue. It was a magnificent piece of Ming pottery. Holmes explained that it was a rare and extremely valuable specimen. More importantly, it was exactly the sort of object which would attract Baron Gruner's attention. Holmes then handed me a card. The name printed upon it was not mine. For that evening I was to become Dr. Hill Barton. My task was to visit Baron Gruner. I was to present myself as a doctor and collector who had acquired a unique piece of Chinese porcelain. I was not to appear eager to sell. I was simply to make the Baron curious. Holmes knew that Gruner's interest in Chinese pottery was more than an ordinary hobby. His collection was one of the weaknesses of his otherwise carefully controlled personality. That weakness was about to become important. The plan was now clear. I would enter Vernon's lodge under a false name. I would carry the precious saucer. I would keep the Baron occupied with the object he valued so highly. And while his attention was elsewhere, Holmes intended to make his own move. At the time, I understood only part of the plan. I knew that the blue saucer was bait. I knew that the Baron had a passion for Chinese pottery, but I did not yet understand how Holmes intended to use those facts to reach the hidden secret at the heart of the case. The following evening, with the saucer carefully protected in my possession and my new identity ready, I set out for Vernon's lodge. London was already dark. The lamps shone through the evening mist, and the wheels of my cab moved steadily toward Kingston. Ahead of me stood the home of Baron Adelbert Gruner, and somewhere within those rooms was the object which might finally break his hold over Violet de Merville. I was going there alone, and for the first time in the entire case, the next move would depend upon me. That evening, I set out for Baron Gruner's house with a small blue saucer carefully protected in my possession. For the occasion, I was no longer Dr. John Watson. I was Hill Barton, a respectable medical man and collector with an interest in Chinese ceramics. The card bearing that name rested in my pocket. My instructions from Holmes were simple enough. I was to speak confidently, avoid unnecessary details, and allow the Baron's own passion for Chinese pottery to keep him interested. The entire plan depended upon one thing. I had to keep him occupied. Holmes believed that Gruner would be unable to resist the opportunity to examine an exceptional piece of porcelain. But there was another purpose behind my visit. While I kept the Baron's attention fixed upon the saucer, Holmes intended to make his own move. I did not yet know exactly what that move would be. I only knew that time was running short. The Baron was due to leave England for America, and Holmes had decided that whatever had to be done must be done before he sailed. The journey took me to a remarkable house. The grounds alone announced the wealth of their owner. A long, winding drive passed between carefully planted shrubs before opening upon a large gravelled space decorated with statues. The house itself had been built during the great boom years by a South African gold magnate. It was an enormous structure, with turrets at the corners and a long, low body. It was not beautiful. Indeed, its architecture seemed almost absurd, but it was imposing. It conveyed exactly the impression that the Baron Adelbert Gruner wished his surroundings to create: power, money, security. I was received by a dignified butler and then passed to a footman who conducted me into the Baron's presence. Gruner was already waiting. He stood before a large glass-fronted cabinet filled with Chinese treasures. In one hand he held a small brown vase. The moment I entered, he turned toward me. His manner was courteous, almost charming. He welcomed me as though I were an old acquaintance, rather than a stranger arriving with an expensive object. He immediately began discussing his collection. He pointed out the little vase he was holding and explained its age and workmanship. Then his eyes went to the package I carried. He asked whether I had brought the Ming saucer mentioned in my note. I carefully removed the wrapping. The blue porcelain appeared beneath the light. The Baron took it from me. His attention changed at once. He carried it to his desk, drew a lamp closer, and began examining it with the concentration of a scholar. I watched him carefully. The light fell across his face, allowing me to study him more closely than I had during our earlier encounters. He was an extraordinarily handsome man. His build was graceful and active. His skin was dark, almost oriental in appearance. His eyes were large and languid, possessing the sort of fascination which could easily attract people. His hair and carefully waxed mustache were black. His features were regular and pleasing. Only his mouth seemed to contradict the rest of his face. It was thin-lipped and hard. There was something cruel about it, something merciless. If ever a face contained a warning, that mouth was the warning. Yet his voice remained pleasant. His manners were perfect. Nothing in his outward behavior suggested the monster described by Kitty Winter. That, I thought, was part of his danger. He could appear gentle while hiding something terrible beneath the surface. At last he looked up. He praised the saucer. Then he asked about the other pieces. I explained that I possessed a set of 6. His interest increased. He wanted to know how I had obtained them. I gave him the vague answer Holmes had prepared. The object was genuine. Its value could be established by an expert. I would leave the matter of price to a proper valuation. Baron did not seem satisfied. He examined me as carefully as he had examined the porcelain. He wanted to know who had taught me of his interest in Chinese pottery. I explained that I knew he had written a book on the subject. Then he asked whether I had read it. I had to admit that I had not. That answer created the first real danger. The Baron smiled. There was something unpleasant in that smile. He pointed out that I claimed to be a serious collector. While apparently knowing little about his published work, I explained that I was a busy doctor. He rejected the excuse. According to him, a man who truly loved a subject followed it seriously, whatever his other occupation might be. Then he began asking questions. At first, they seemed harmless. Then they became increasingly technical. He asked about Chinese emperors and ancient collections. He asked about the Emperor Shomu and the Shoso Inn near Nara. He questioned me about the Northern Wei dynasty and its place in ceramic history. I knew enough from Holmes's crash course to understand the general subject, but I was not a genuine expert, and the Baron knew it. The questions were no longer part of an ordinary conversation. They were a test. He was trying to discover who I really was. I could feel the danger increasing. If I failed the examination completely, he might order me from the house. Worse, he might discover that the visit had nothing to do with Chinese pottery. So I did the only thing I could think of. I became angry. I pushed myself to my feet and protested that I had come to offer him a valuable object, not to sit an examination. I reminded him that my knowledge might be considerable, even if it was not equal to his own. I refused to answer questions, which I considered offensive. For a moment, he simply stared at me. The pleasant expression disappeared. The languor left his eyes. His gaze became hard and direct. Then I saw the teeth between those cruel lips. He understood. The Baron knew that I was not what I claimed to be. His voice changed. He asked what game I was playing. He accused me of being a spy, an emissary of Sherlock Holmes. He had heard that Holmes was dying. Therefore, he suggested, Holmes sent his assistants to watch him. The accusation was made with frightening certainty. I realized that the deception had failed. Perhaps he had suspected me from the moment I entered. Perhaps the questions about Chinese pottery had merely confirmed what he already believed. Either way, I could no longer pretend. The Baron suddenly sprang to his feet. I stepped backwards. For one terrible moment, I expected him to attack me. He reached into a drawer and began searching through it furiously. I could not see what he was looking for. Then something caught his attention. He stopped. He listened. His entire expression changed. He seemed to have heard something from the adjoining room. Ah! He turned sharply. Then he rushed through the doorway behind him. I moved at once. I crossed the room and reached the open door. What I saw in the next room is something I shall never forget. The window leading into the garden stood wide open. Beside it was a figure. For an instant I hardly recognized him. His head was wrapped in bloody bandages. His face was pale and drawn. He looked almost like a ghost, but there could be no mistake. It was Sherlock Holmes. He had been reported to be close to death. The newspapers described his condition as critical. Yet here he stood inside Baron Gruner's house. The Baron stared at him. Holmes did not wait. With extraordinary speed, he climbed through the open window. I heard the sound of his body landing among the laurel bushes outside. The Baron gave a furious cry. He rushed toward the window. I followed. For one instant, everything seemed to happen at once. The Baron leaned out after Holmes. The garden beyond was dark. The evening air had turned cold. And then I saw movement among the leaves. An arm appeared. A woman's arm. The Baron saw it too. His face changed. He gave a terrible cry. It was not the cry of an angry man. It was the cry of someone who had suddenly understood that something dreadful was about to happen. He raised both hands toward his face. Then the first drops struck him, and in that instant, the entire balance of the case changed. The man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly the victim. The man who had frightened others was suddenly screaming, and the woman who had sworn to destroy him had finally found her opportunity. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to understand what I was seeing. Then the Baron began screaming for water. The attack had begun. And outside, somewhere in the darkness, Sherlock Holmes was already disappearing into the night. The Baron's cry echoed through the house. I had barely understood what had happened when the full horror became clear. A woman had thrown vitriol through the open window. The burning liquid had struck Gruner in the face. He staggered away from the window, clutching his features with both hands. His cries filled the room as he stumbled blindly across the carpet. For a man who had always appeared so controlled, the transformation was shocking. The handsome face I had been studying only moments earlier was already being destroyed. The Baron screamed for water. I seized a carafe from the table and hurried to him. The household had been alerted by the noise. The butler and several footmen rushed into the room, followed by others from the house. One of them fainted when he saw the condition of his master. The vitriol had burned across Gruner's face. One eye was already becoming white and useless. The other was red and inflamed. His skin was discolored and horribly damaged. Yet even through the agony, his mind remained fixed upon the person he believed responsible. He cried out Kitty Winter's name. He demanded that she be punished. He raged against the woman who had finally turned his own cruelty back upon him. I did what I could. I treated the burns as best I knew how until medical assistance arrived. Oil was applied to the injured surfaces. Cotton was placed over the worst of the burns. Morphia was administered to ease his terrible suffering. The suspicion which had filled his mind only minutes earlier had disappeared. He was no longer concerned with discovering whether I had come from Holmes. He was simply a wounded man, desperate for relief. His hands clung to mine, as though I possessed some power to restore what had been taken from him, but I could do nothing of the sort. Soon his family doctor arrived, followed by a specialist. A police inspector also appeared. At that point, there was no reason to maintain my false identity. I gave the inspector my real card. There was little point in pretending otherwise. I was already well known to the police, and the night's events could go far beyond anything that could be concealed. I left the house. It was a place of darkness and terror now. But my thoughts were not upon the Baron. They were upon Sherlock Holmes. Within an hour, I was back at Baker Street. Holmes was there. He looked pale and exhausted. His own injuries had clearly taken their toll, and even his normally unshakable nerves had been affected by the events. I told him everything. He listened carefully as I described what had happened to Gruner. The vitriol attack had been terrible, but Holmes showed no triumph. Instead, he regarded the matter with grim seriousness. The attack had changed the Baron physically, but that was not enough. The marriage was still the real objective. Holmes had no intention of allowing Violet de Merville to marry the man simply because his face had been destroyed. There was something else that had to be done. And then Holmes revealed the real purpose of the entire operation. The brown book. Kitty Winter had told us about it. The book in which Gruner had recorded the women he had ruined. Names, photographs, details. A private record of the damage he had inflicted upon other lives. Holmes believed that this book could succeed where every warning and every accusation had failed. The problem was obtaining it. Gruner was cautious. At night, his house was protected by a burglar alarm. A direct burglary would therefore be extremely difficult. But Holmes had recognized an opportunity. The Baron was a collector, not merely a casual admirer of Chinese pottery, but a serious and obsessive connoisseur. If something rare enough appeared before him, his attention could be completely absorbed. That was where my strange assignment came in. The blue saucer. Holmes had obtained a delicate piece of Ming porcelain. It was wrapped carefully in fine Eastern silk. He showed it to me. It was an extraordinarily beautiful object, deep blue and extremely delicate. Holmes explained that genuine pieces of this quality were almost beyond price. The entire collection to which it belonged would be worth an enormous fortune. Then he gave me another object. It carried the name of a man I was to pretend to be, Dr. Hill Barton. For the evening, John Watson was to disappear. Dr. Hill Barton was to take his place. Holmes explained exactly how I should approach the Baron. I was to write beforehand. I was to announce that I possessed an exceptional piece of Ming pottery. I was to suggest that the Baron might wish to purchase it. I was also to appear knowledgeable enough to make the story believable. The disguise itself was not difficult. The difficult part was the subject. I knew almost nothing about Chinese ceramics. Holmes, however, had a solution. He ordered me to spend the next 24 hours studying the subject. I obeyed. I went to the London Library and obtained a large volume on Chinese pottery. Then began one of the strangest periods of study in my life. For hours, I absorbed names, dates, and historical details. I learned about the great decorators. I studied the different periods of Chinese ceramics. I memorized information about the Ming dynasty. I read about the Hung Wu and Yongle periods. I studied Tang Ying and the primitive work of the Sung and Yuan dynasties. It was an extraordinary amount of knowledge to force into my head in a very short time. But Holmes had chosen the subject carefully. He knew that the Baron's obsession would make him curious, and curiosity would make him vulnerable. By the following evening, Holmes was out of bed. The newspapers still suggested that he was close to death, but the reality was very different. His injuries were serious, yet his mind remained completely focused. When I entered Baker Street, he tested me on my newly acquired knowledge. I had done my best. Whether I could actually pass as a genuine expert was another matter. Holmes then produced a little blue saucer. He wrapped it carefully and gave it to me. He explained that it was an exceptionally fine example of Ming porcelain. It was the kind of object that would excite a genuine collector. That was exactly the reaction he expected from Gruner. The plan was simple. I would go to the Baron. I would present myself as Dr. Hill Barton. I would explain that I had obtained a unique piece of Chinese pottery and was considering selling it. The Baron, Holmes was certain, would see me. His passion for collecting was too strong for him to ignore such an opportunity. Holmes even prepared the letter I was to send. It was brief and polite, but it was designed to awaken the Baron's curiosity. I sent it, then I set out. The journey to Gruner's house felt very different this time. I was not going there openly as Watson. I was carrying a false name, a valuable piece of porcelain, and a carefully constructed story. But beneath all of it was another purpose. While I kept Gruner occupied, Holmes would attempt to enter the house. The success of the entire plan depended upon the Baron believing that I had come solely because of the saucer. When I arrived, the wealth of the place was immediately apparent. The long drive, the carefully maintained grounds, the statues, the enormous house, everything spoke of money and security. I was received by the household staff and eventually shown into the Baron's presence. He was standing before a large cabinet filled with Chinese treasures. The moment he saw the package, his attention sharpened. He already knew why I come. I presented the saucer. He examined it beneath the light. For several moments he appeared completely absorbed. This was precisely the reaction Holmes had predicted. But there was a danger I had not fully appreciated. Gruner was not merely a collector. He was an expert, and experts are difficult to deceive. He questioned me about the origin of the piece. He wanted to know how I had obtained it. I avoided giving him unnecessary information. I explained that I was prepared to have its value established by an expert. The Baron remained suspicious. He examined the porcelain again. Then he began examining me. He asked whether I had read his book on Chinese ceramics. I admitted that I had not. That answer immediately weakened my position. He could not understand how a genuine collector could possess such an important piece without having studied the leading work on the subject. I explained that I was a busy doctor, but he rejected the explanation. Then he began asking questions. The questions became increasingly difficult. He asked about historical figures. He asked about ancient Chinese collections. He questioned me about the Emperor Shomu and the Shoso-in near Nara. He asked about the Northern Wei dynasty. The conversation had ceased to be about buying porcelain, had become an examination. I realized that he was testing me. Every answer I gave might reveal the truth. Every hesitation might expose me. And somewhere inside that enormous house, Holmes was supposed to be moving toward the real objective, the brown book. I needed to keep Gruner occupied, so I deliberately allowed my temper to rise. I protested that I had not come to be examined like a schoolboy. Told him that I had offered him an opportunity to acquire a remarkable object, and that I would not submit to an insulting interrogation. For a moment, the Baron said nothing. He simply stared at me. Then his expression changed. The pleasant collector vanished. The charming voice disappeared. His eyes became hard. He suddenly understood. I was not Dr. Hill Barton. I was Watson. And he believed that Sherlock Holmes had sent me. The Baron accused me of being a spy. He suggested that Holmes, supposedly dying from his injuries, had sent his agents to keep watch upon him. Then he rose. I stepped back. His hand went toward a drawer. I prepared myself for the possibility that the evening might end very badly. Then something caught his attention. He heard a sound. His head turned. For a moment he listened. Then he suddenly rushed into the adjoining room. I followed. And there, beyond the open doorway, I saw something that made the entire deception suddenly clear. The garden window was open. Beside it stood a pale figure, a man with a bandaged head. A man who should have been lying helpless in Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes. He had entered the house. He had reached the place we needed. And now the Baron knew that something far more dangerous than a porcelain dealer had been operating inside his home. Holmes looked directly toward us. Then he moved. In an instant, he climbed through the window and disappeared into the garden. The Baron rushed after him. I remained inside. The plan had reached its most dangerous moment. The Baron had discovered the deception, but Holmes had already gained access to the house, and somewhere behind those walls was the object that could finally destroy the marriage. The brown leather book, the record of every woman Gruner had ruined. If Holmes could get it out, Violet de Merville might finally be forced to see the man she loved for Cole was. But if Gruner caught Holmes first, the entire plan could collapse, and I had no idea what was waiting for us in the darkness beyond that window. For one moment, I could not understand what I had seen. Sherlock Holmes had vanished through the open window. The sound of his body striking the bushes outside was still fresh in my ears. Then Baron Gruner rushed after him. The calm and polished collector had disappeared completely. There was nothing left now but fury. He reached the window and leaned out, searching the darkness below. I remained where I was. Every nerve in my body was tense. The plan had failed in one respect. The Baron knew that I was Watson. He knew that Holmes had entered his house. And he knew that we had not come for Chinese porcelain. Yet there was still something that I did not understand. Why had Holmes risked entering the house at all? Then I saw it. An arm appeared from among the bushes. It was the arm of a woman. Moved quickly toward the open window. For an instant, I saw nothing more. Then came the Baron's scream. It was not a cry of anger. It was the scream of a man who had suddenly been struck by unbearable pain. He clapped both hands over his face. He staggered backward. Then he began to run blindly around the room. His cries filled the house. He struck against the furniture. He beat his head against the walls. He fell to the carpet and rolled from side to side. The man who had faced danger with such confidence only moments before was now completely broken by agony. He cried for water. I rushed to him. The servants came running from the hall. One of them saw the Baron's face and immediately collapsed. I understood then what had happened. The liquid had been thrown through the window. Vitriol. The same terrible weapon that had been threatened before. The same weapon that Kitty Winter had promised to use against the man who had ruined her life. I knelt beside the Baron. His face had already changed horribly. The handsome features that had fascinated so many women were now burned and disfigured. The eyes that had once appeared so dark and compelling were swollen and damaged. The skin was raw and discolored. It was difficult to look at him. Yet, I was a doctor. Whatever my feelings toward the man, I could not abandon him. I asked for oil. I treated the burns as best I could. I covered the damaged areas with cotton. The Baron continued to scream. His hands reached toward me. He seemed to believe that I possessed some power to undo what had happened. But medicine could only ease the pain. It could not restore his face. Between his cries, he shouted the name of Kitty Winter. He cursed her. He called her a devil. He swore that she would pay for what she had done. The irony of it was terrible. For weeks, we had been trying to save Violet de Merville from this man. Now the man himself had been attacked by the very woman whose life he had destroyed. But I had no time for reflection. The family surgeon arrived. A specialist followed soon afterward. The police also came. At that point, my false identity was useless. I gave the inspector my real card. There was no advantage in pretending to be Dr. Hill Barton any longer. I was known at Scotland Yard almost as well as Holmes himself. My part in the deception was finished. I left the house. The place had become one of horror. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. The great house stood dark behind me, its windows glowing against the wet night. I made my way back to Baker Street. Holmes was waiting there. He was pale. His head was still heavily bandaged. He looked exhausted, but there was something in his expression that told me the operation had not failed. I began to tell him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I described the Baron's terrible injuries, Holmes showed no satisfaction. Instead, his face became grave. He understood the price that had been paid, but he also understood something else. The attack upon the Baron was not the important victory. The real victory had been achieved inside the house. I noticed a brown volume lying upon the table. Holmes placed his hand upon it. This was the book Kitty Winter had told us about, the private record of Baron Gruner's victims. For a long time, Holmes had believed that this book was the key to the entire case. He had understood something that we had almost overlooked. Destroying the Baron's physical beauty would not necessarily destroy Violet's love for him. Indeed, it might have the opposite effect. A woman deeply in love might see a disfigured man as a tragic victim. She might feel pity. She might become even more determined to stand beside him. Holmes, therefore, had no interest in winning through the Baron's appearance. He wanted to destroy the image Violet had built in her mind. He wanted her to see the man behind the charm. And that was what the brown book contained. The evidence was in Gruner's own hand. There could be no denial, no claim that his enemies had invented stories about him, no suggestion that the accusations were merely gossip. The book recorded the women, their names, their photographs, their histories, the details of the relationships, the record of what had happened to them. It was the portrait of a predator, written by the predator himself. Holmes explained that the moment Kitty had mentioned the book, He had understood its importance, but he had not wanted to reveal his interest. If Kitty had known how valuable the book was, she might have tried to obtain it herself. The Baron would then have taken greater precautions. So Holmes had waited. Then the attack upon him had changed everything. When the Baron believed Holmes was badly injured, he no longer considered him in immediate danger. That was useful. Holmes had deliberately allowed the Baron to believe that his injuries were worse than they really were. The newspapers had helped. Reports suggested that Holmes was close to death. The Baron believed a story. That gave Holmes the freedom he needed. But there was another problem. The Baron was planning to leave England. He was going to America. He would never have left such a dangerous document behind. If the book was to be obtained, it had to be taken quickly. A night burglary would have been almost impossible. The house was protected. The Baron was cautious, but an evening visit was different. If the Baron's attention could be completely occupied, Holmes could enter the house and search for the book. That was where I had come into the plan. The blue saucer had never been the real objective. It was bait. The Baron's passion for Chinese ceramics was so strong that the sight of a rare Ming piece would hold his attention. But Holmes had another concern. He needed enough time. That was why I had been forced to learn about Chinese pottery. If the Baron had asked me a few simple questions, the conversation might have ended too quickly. Instead, Holmes had made me study enough material to keep the deception alive. It had been an uncomfortable education, but it had served its purpose. While the Baron examined me and questioned my knowledge, Holmes had entered the house. He had found the book. He had taken it, but he had not been able to leave without being seen. The Baron had heard something. He had rushed into the adjoining room. He had seen Holmes. Holmes had escaped through the window. The Baron had followed, and then Kitty Winter had struck. The timing had been astonishing. For a few moments, the entire operation had balanced upon the edge of disaster. Yet Holmes had obtained what we needed. The brown book was now in our possession. I looked at it with a feeling that I cannot easily describe. It was only a book, a brown volume filled with writing and photographs. Yet it carried enough truth to destroy the reputation of a man who had spent his life hiding behind charm. Holmes told me that the book would now be placed in the hands of the gentleman who had employed us. That gentleman could decide how best to use it. I was still curious. Indeed, I had been curious from the beginning. The mysterious client had remained unknown to me, but Holmes had not yet explained his identity. Before long, our visitor arrived. It was Sir James. He entered with the same dignity and calm manner with which he had first come to Baker Street. Holmes explained what had happened. Sir James listened carefully. He praised us for what we had achieved. But he had one concern. We wondered whether the Baron's disfigurement had already accomplished enough. Surely Violet could no longer wish to marry him. Holmes disagreed. He explained that a woman deeply in love might become even more devoted to a man. She believed him to be a tragic victim. The physical damage was therefore not enough. The moral truth was what mattered. The brown book was the weapon that could reach her. Sir James understood. He took the book. He also took the precious blue saucer. Then he prepared to leave. I followed him downstairs. Outside, a waiting brougham stood in the street. Sir James entered it quickly. As the carriage moved away, he threw his overcoat across the side of the vehicle. But he was too late. I had already seen the armorial bearings. The sight made me stop. At last, I understood who our mysterious client was. I hurried back upstairs. Holmes was sitting quietly in his room. I could hardly contain my excitement. I told him that I had discovered the identity of our client. I was about to name him. Holmes raised one hand. He stopped me. He told me that the identity did not matter. The man was a loyal friend, a chivalrous gentleman. That was enough. I accepted his answer. There were some secrets which Holmes considered more important than curiosity, and this was one of them. I never learned exactly how the brown book was used. Sir James may have handled the matter himself. More likely, the evidence was placed before Violet's father. Whoever delivered it, the result was immediate. Only 3 days later, the newspapers carried the news. The marriage between Baron Adelbert Gruner and Miss Violet Merville would not take place. The announcement was brief, but to us, it meant everything. The marriage had been stopped. Violet had been saved from a man who had hidden his true nature behind beauty, wealth, and charm. The brown book had done what warnings could not. It had shown her the truth in the Baron's own handwriting. There was another report in the same paper. Kitty Winter had appeared before the police court on the serious charge of throwing vitriol. The circumstances surrounding the attack had been considered. There had been strong evidence of the terrible life that had driven her to such an act. She received the lowest possible sentence for the offense. As for Sherlock Holmes, there was one final complication. He had technically committed burglary. He had entered the Baron's house without permission. There was even the possibility that he might be prosecuted, but the matter did not go further. The cause had been a good one, and the client had been sufficiently illustrious. The strict machinery of British law, on this occasion, proved remarkably flexible, so the case ended. The Baron had lost the woman he intended to marry. His secret record had been taken from him. Kitty Winter had paid for her revenge, and Holmes had once again shown me that the most important weapon in an investigation is not always a clue, a fingerprint, or a confession. Sometimes it is simply the truth, and in this case, the truth had been written down by the villain himself. The brown book had merely needed to find its way into the right hands. Within an hour of leaving Baron Gruner's house, I was back in Baker Street. The events of that evening had left me deeply shaken. I had seen many terrible things during my medical career. I had seen men wounded in accidents, soldiers broken by violence, and patients brought close to death by disease. But what I had witnessed at the Baron's house was different. Only a short time earlier, Gruner had been sitting beneath the lamp, handsome, confident, and perfectly composed. Then, in a single moment, his appearance had been destroyed. The terrible attack had left a deep impression upon me. Yet when I entered Holmes's room, I found that my friend was thinking about something else. He was sitting in his familiar chair. He looked pale and exhausted. His injuries were still obvious. The bandages around his head were stained, and his face showed the strain of the evening, but his mind was already working. Holmes listened carefully as I described what had happened after he had escaped through the window. I told him about the Baron's screams. I told him how the servants had rushed into the room. I told him how I had treated the burns, until the family surgeon and a specialist arrived. Holmes listened in silence. When I had finished, he remained quiet for several seconds. Then he reached toward the table. His fingers closed around a brown volume. He lifted it and looked at it thoughtfully. This was the book, the mysterious book, which Kitty Winter had told us about. The book that contained the darkest secrets of Baron Gruner's life. Holmes placed it upon his knee. His expression became serious. "The wages of sin, Watson," he said. He spoke quietly. There was no pleasure in his voice, no excitement, only a grim understanding that the events of the evening had been the result of a long chain of wrongdoing. He told me that sooner or later such a life brought consequences, but the book in his hands was far more important than the injuries suffered by the Baron. The book could do what violence could not. It could stop the marriage. I looked at it with curiosity. For some time I had wondered what secrets it contained. Now I finally had it before me. It was not an ordinary diary. It was a record of the women who had passed through Gruner's life. Holmes described it as a love diary. Then, with his usual sharpness, he corrected himself. It was more accurately a record of lust. The distinction was important. Gruner had not written the book as a confession. He had written it as a private record. He had preserved details that any decent man would have been ashamed to reveal. There were names, there were descriptions, there were photographs, there were accounts of relationships that showed a pattern of manipulation and cruelty. And there was something especially dangerous about the book. It was written by Gruner himself. That meant that the evidence could not easily be dismissed as gossip. If someone accused him of misconduct, he could deny it. If a woman spoke against him, he could call her jealous. If an enemy spread rumors, he could claim that the stories were invented. But this book was different. It came from his own hand. Holmes had understood its value the moment Kitty Winter told us about it. Yet he had deliberately said nothing. That was important. Kitty Winter was desperate for revenge. If she had known how much Holmes valued the book, she might have tried to obtain it herself. She might have attacked Gruner for it. She might have warned him. Any of those things could have ruined the entire plan. So Holmes had remained silent. He had simply stored the information in his mind. Then his own encounter with the Baron had created an unexpected opportunity. Gruner believed that Holmes had been badly injured. The newspapers had helped create that impression. The Baron had been allowed to believe that Holmes was almost dying. To Gruner, this meant that Holmes was no longer an immediate threat. That belief was extremely useful. Holmes explained that he could now move more freely. The Baron would not expect him to appear again. He would not think that Holmes was capable of entering his house. And that gave my friend the opportunity he needed. But Holmes had not originally intended to act that night. He would have preferred to wait. A better opportunity might have appeared. However, there was a serious problem. Gruner was preparing to leave for America. The Baron would not take the book with him if he could avoid it. The book was too dangerous. It contained too much information. If it fell into the hands of the wrong person, Gruner could be ruined. Therefore, Holmes knew that once the Baron left England, the opportunity might disappear forever. There was no time to waste. Yet taking the book was not easy. Gruner was careful. He took precautions. A night burglary would have been extremely difficult. The house was protected. The servants were alert, and Gruner himself was not a man who could easily be surprised. Holmes, therefore, needed another way. He needed a reason for Gruner to be distracted. That was where I had entered the plan. The blue saucer had been the key. It was a beautiful and extremely valuable piece of Chinese porcelain. Gruner had a passion for such objects. Holmes knew that a rare piece could hold his attention, but even that was not enough. I had to appear convincing. I could not simply arrive with a saucer and claim to be a collector. Gruner was an expert. He would ask questions. He would test me. He would quickly discover that I knew almost nothing about the subject. That was why Holmes had forced me to spend hours studying Chinese ceramics. I had memorized names and dates. I had learned enough to speak intelligently. At the time, I had thought it an absurd amount of work for a simple deception. Now I understood. Every detail had been necessary. Holmes needed me to keep Gruner occupied for as long as possible. While the Baron examined the saucer and questioned me, Holmes could search for the book. But there was one final difficulty. Holmes had to know where the book was kept. He could not search the entire house. There was no time. The Baron might discover me. the servants might enter. And if Gruner became suspicious, Holmes could be trapped. So my task had been more important than I had realized. I was not merely pretending to sell porcelain. I was buying Holmes' time. Every question I answered, every argument I created, every moment I kept Gruner talking, all of it gave Holmes another few seconds to search. I remembered the scene clearly. Gruner had examined the blue saucer under the yellow light. At first he had been fascinated, then suspicious. He had asked where it came from. He had questioned my right to sell it. He had tested my knowledge. I had felt his eyes upon me. He had studied every answer. Eventually, he had realized the truth. He had recognized that I was not really a collector. And then he had understood that Holmes was behind the whole affair. At that moment, the danger had become extreme. Holmes had been forced to escape through the window. I had been left inside, the furious and suspicious man. Then Kitty Winter had attacked. Everything had happened within moments, and yet Holmes had succeeded. The brown book now lay safely upon the table in Baker Street. I looked at it again. It seemed almost too ordinary. A simple volume, a collection of pages. But Holmes knew that it contained enough evidence to destroy the future Gruner had planned for himself. The Baron wanted Violet de Merville. He wanted her to become his wife. He had used his appearance, charm, confidence, and reputation to win her. To Violet, he had created an image of himself as an extraordinary man. Holmes understood that image had to be destroyed. Not his face, his character. The attack with vitriol had changed the Baron physically, but physical damage alone might not save Violet. Indeed, Holmes feared that it might have the opposite effect. A woman deeply in love might see a disfigured man as a tragic figure. She might feel pity. She might become more devoted to him. She might believe that the world had treated him unfairly. That was not enough. Violet needed to know exactly who he was. She needed to see his actions. She needed to see the evidence. And above all, she needed to see it without the Baron standing beside her and controlling the story. The brown book could do that. Holmes told me that no respectable woman could read such a record and still willingly marry the man who had written it. I could not disagree, yet I felt uneasy. There was something disturbing about possessing another man's private diary, but Holmes reminded me that the book was not being used for curiosity. It was being used to prevent a marriage that could destroy a young woman's life. That distinction mattered. The following events moved quickly. The book had to reach the right person. Holmes had already arranged for the mysterious client to receive it. That client had remained hidden throughout our investigation. He had employed Holmes to prevent the marriage. He had trusted my friend with a task that was both delicate and dangerous. Now the final piece was in his hands. I watched Holmes carefully. Despite his exhaustion, he seemed satisfied. Not pleased by the Baron's suffering, satisfied that the evidence had been obtained. That was the difference. Holmes had never sought revenge for its own sake. He had wanted to stop Gruner. The Baron's own actions had created the evidence that would finally defeat him. The book was therefore more powerful than any physical attack. It could follow Gruner wherever he went. Even if his face healed, even if he regained his confidence, even if he tried to begin again in another country, the record remained. And there was one person who mattered above all others, Violet. If she read the book, the illusion would be gone. The handsome Baron would no longer appear as a romantic figure. She would see the cruelty beneath the charm. She would see the pattern behind the stories. She would understand that the man she intended to marry was not the man she believed him to be. Holmes leaned back in his chair. For the first time that night, I saw some of the tension leave his face. The dangerous part of the operation was over. We had obtained the book. The Baron had been stopped from leaving England with his secret, and the evidence was now beyond his control. But I knew that there was still one final question. Would Violet believe it? Would the book be strong enough to overcome her love? Holmes believed that it would. I hoped that he was right. The next few days would tell us. For now, the brown book remained on the table between us. It was quiet. It was harmless in appearance. Yet within its pages was the story of a man who had hidden his true nature behind beauty and charm. And now that story was about to be read by the one woman who needed to know it most. The case had begun with a desperate warning. It had passed through violence, deception, and danger. Now the final battle would not be fought with fists or weapons. It would be fought with truth. And sometimes, as Sherlock Holmes had taught me many times, the truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. Yet the case did not leave my mind. When the immediate danger had passed, some adventures with Sherlock Holmes ended neatly. A criminal was arrested, a mystery was explained, and life at Baker Street soon returned to its ordinary rhythm. This affair was different. There had been no simple criminal to hand over to the police. There had been no single missing object to recover. Instead, we had been trying to prevent a future tragedy. The danger had always been waiting ahead of us. A young woman was preparing to marry a man whose past she did not truly understand. Her father knew that the marriage might ruin her life. Her friends knew it. Holmes knew it. And yet the person whose future mattered most remained unconvinced. That was what made the case so difficult. I had often seen Holmes solve problems by discovering something which nobody else had noticed. But this was not simply a problem of evidence. The evidence already existed. The Baron's past was known. His reputation had followed him across Europe. There had been accusations. There had been women who had suffered because of him. There had even been a woman willing to risk imprisonment in order to strike back at him. And still, Violet de Merville loved him. The difficulty was not finding the truth. The difficulty was making another person accept it. That distinction stayed with me. For several days after the affair, I found myself thinking about Violet. I wondered what had passed through her mind when she finally learned the contents of the brown book. Wondered whether she had read every page. I wondered whether she had looked at the photographs. And I wondered what it must have been like to see the man she loved described by his own hand. The Baron had been able to explain away accusations made by others. He could claim that former companions were bitter. He could call his enemies dishonest. He could present himself as a misunderstood gentleman. But the book was different. It was not written by an enemy. It was written by him. There was no convenient witness to attack. No angry woman whose motives could be questioned. No newspaper report which could be dismissed as scandal. There was simply the man's own record. Holmes had understood that this was the one form of evidence Violet could not easily escape. At first I had wondered whether taking such a private book was justified, but the longer I considered the matter, the less troubled I became. A secret kept by a dangerous man is not the same thing as a private letter between innocent people. The book was evidence of a pattern, and the pattern concerned the future of a young woman who was about to place her life completely in his hands. Holmes had never been sentimental about evidence. He cared about what it proved. That was one of the qualities which separated him from ordinary investigators. He did not ask whether a clue was pleasant. He asked whether it was true. The same principle had guided him throughout this case. He had been willing to deceive Gruner. He had been willing to use a false illness. He had sent me to the Baron's house under a false name. He had entered the house himself without permission. None of these things were methods which he would have chosen lightly, yet he believed the danger justified them. I remember the evening after the case had effectively been decided. Baker Street was unusually quiet. The fire had burned low. Outside, London was wrapped in one of those damp evenings which seemed to soften every sound. From the street below came the distant movement of carriages. Occasionally, wheels passed through a patch of water with a soft rush. The lamps shone through the mist. Holmes sat in his chair near the fire. His injuries were beginning to heal. The bandages had been reduced. The wounds upon his head were no longer as serious as they had appeared during the first days, but he was still tired. I had rarely seen him so physically exhausted. The case had taken something from him, not his confidence. Never that, but his strength had been tested. The attack in Regent Street had been serious. The danger inside Gruner's house had been greater still, yet Holmes seemed less interested in his own injuries than in the outcome of the case. He had been concerned with one question from the beginning: would Violet be saved? Now we had our answer. The marriage would not take place. That was enough. Holmes had no desire for public praise. He did not need newspapers to celebrate him. Indeed, the less attention drawn to the matter, the better. The Baron himself had suffered enough publicity already. His name had been surrounded by scandal. His marriage had failed. His face had been horribly injured. His secret record had been taken from him, and the police were now aware of Kitty Winter's attack. There was little left for Holmes to do. Yet I found myself thinking about the Baron. He had been an extraordinary man in one respect. He possessed many qualities which, in another person, might have been admirable. He was intelligent. He was educated. He had considerable knowledge. He was physically attractive. He possessed courage. He could charm people with ease. He understood the weaknesses of others. He could make himself appear sympathetic. He could speak softly when another man might have raised his voice. But all those qualities had been placed in the service of something dark. That was perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the affair. Evil does not always appear ugly. Sometimes it is elegant. Sometimes it is educated. Sometimes it speaks gently and dresses beautifully. Sometimes it smiles. The Baron had understood this better than most men. His appearance had protected him. His manners had protected him. His intelligence had protected him. And his ability to make people believe what he wanted them to believe protected him most of all. Violet had not fallen in love with a monster as she imagined one. She had fallen in love with a man who had carefully hidden the monster. That was why Holmes had been so determined to reach her. He knew that arguments would fail. He knew that warnings would fail. He knew that Kitty Winter's testimony would be rejected. He therefore needed something that could not be changed by persuasion. The book provided it. It was an unusual kind of victory. Holmes had not caught Gruner in the act of committing a crime. He had not forced a confession. He had not placed handcuffs upon him. Instead, he had removed the protection which Gruner had built around himself. He had taken away his story. Once the truth was visible, the Baron could no longer control it. I thought of Kitty Winter as well. Her part in the affair troubled me more than I liked to admit. I had treated her with some severity in my own mind when I first heard what she intended. Throwing vitriol was a terrible act. There could be no question about that. The injuries she inflicted upon Gruner were dreadful, yet it was impossible to ignore what had driven her to that moment. She had been one of the Baron's victims. She had lived through the charm, the control, and the eventual cruelty. She had come to hate him with a hatred born from suffering. Holmes understood this. He did not approve of her violence, but neither did he pretend that her motives had appeared from nowhere. That was why the circumstances of her trial mattered. The court earned something of her history. The circumstances were considered, and the sentence was the lowest possible for the offense. It was not an acquittal. The law could not simply excuse what she had done, but there was recognition that the story was more complicated than a simple act of violence. I found that strangely comforting. Justice at its best must look beyond the final act. It must understand the road that led there. And perhaps that was another reason why the case remained in my memory. Nothing about it was simple. The victim could become an attacker. The charming gentleman could become the villain. The detective could become a burglar. The private book could become the instrument of justice. And the mysterious client who had begun the entire affair could remain unknown. Holmes had discovered his identity. I had discovered it too. At least, I had recognized the family arms upon the carriage, but Holmes had stopped me before I could say the name. He regarded the identity as something that should remain private. I respected him for that. There was a certain nobility in the arrangement. The client had come to us because he wanted to protect someone. He had not sought fame. He had not wanted the Baron publicly destroyed for his own satisfaction. He wanted a young woman saved from a disastrous marriage. That was all. In later years, I came to understand that Holmes respected such motives. He could be sarcastic. He could be impatient. He could be ruthless toward criminals. But he had a deep respect for courage and loyalty. The mysterious client possessed both. Perhaps that was why Holmes guarded his secret so carefully. The newspapers, naturally, did not know the whole story. They reported only fragments: the broken engagement, the proceedings against Kitty Winter, the strange circumstances surrounding the famous detective. There was even the possibility that Holmes himself might face prosecution for entering Gruner's house. That possibility amused me somewhat. Sherlock Holmes, the defender of justice, standing in the dock for burglary. It was an amusing image, yet the matter never reached that stage. The circumstances were too unusual. The purpose had been good. The client was influential. And as I had learned many times during our adventures, the law was sometimes more flexible when the people involved possessed sufficient influence. Holmes himself treated the matter lightly. He was not interested in legal arguments. His attention had already moved elsewhere. That was another characteristic of my friend. Once a case was finished, he could leave it behind with remarkable ease. I was not so fortunate. I carried memories. Perhaps that is one reason I became the chronicler of our adventures. Holmes remembered facts. I remembered people. I remembered the expression upon a face, the sound of a voice, the atmosphere of a room, the silence after a terrible discovery, and I remembered Violet. She had been young. She had been intelligent. She had been deeply in love. Yet love had almost carried her into a life from which there might have been no easy escape. That thought troubled me. It also made me think of Holmes in a different way. Many people regarded him as a machine for solving mysteries. They saw the sharp eyes, the quick deductions, the extraordinary memory. They admired the logic. But there was another side to him. He cared deeply when he believed that an innocent person was in danger. He might hide that concern behind cold reasoning. He might speak as though the matter were simply another intellectual problem, but underneath the method was something human. That was particularly clear in this case. He had been willing to risk his life for a woman he had never met. He had allowed himself to be attacked. He had endured injury. He had planned an elaborate deception. He entered a dangerous house, and he had done it all because he believed that one person's future depended upon success. That was not merely deduction. It was courage. Little did I know then how often the memory of that case would return to me when considering the strange ways in which human beings can deceive themselves. For a few evenings after the affair, Holmes and I resumed our ordinary routine. The newspapers were pushed aside. The fire was lit. London continued outside our windows. Cabs passed through Baker Street. The footsteps of strangers moved along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, and life went on. Yet the memory of the Baron remained. There are cases which are remembered because they contain an extraordinary puzzle. There are others remembered because they reveal something about human nature. The affair of Baron Gruner belonged to the second kind. Holmes had solved the practical problem, but the deeper problem had been human. How could a sensible young woman love a man whose past was so terrible? How could charm overcome evidence? How could a person knowingly accept danger because the heart wished to believe something else? Those questions have no simple answer. Perhaps there never will be one. But Holmes shown me something. When reason fails to reach a person, one must sometimes find the truth in a form that cannot be argued away. In this case, that form was a little brown book. And because of it, one young woman was spared a terrible future. There was little more to be said about the affair. The danger had passed. The marriage had been abandoned. The secret book had reached the hands of those who needed to see it. And the strange chain of events which had begun with an unknown visitor at Baker Street had finally come to an end. Yet, as often happened after one of our more unusual cases, the final outcome was not immediately clear to me. I knew only what Holmes had chosen to tell me. The Baron had been stopped. Violet de Merville would not become his wife. Kitty Winter would face the consequences of her own violent revenge. And somewhere behind all these events stood the mysterious man who had first brought the case to Baker Street. His identity was known to Holmes. It was known to me. But it was not something we were expected to discuss. The whole matter had been conducted under a strange veil of secrecy. That secrecy was perhaps necessary. The client had come to Holmes because he wished to protect the honor and happiness of another person. He had not come seeking attention. He had not asked for revenge. He had not even wished his own name to become connected with the affair. His purpose had been simple. He wanted Violet saved. That was enough for Holmes, and in the end, it was enough for me. A few days later, the newspapers confirmed what we already knew. The marriage between Baron Adelbert Gruner and Miss Violet de Merville would not take place. The announcement was brief. There was no detailed explanation, no account of the strange battle that had taken place behind closed doors, no mention of Holmes' disguises, no mention of the book, no mention of the dangerous visit to Gruner's house. To the readers of the newspapers, it was simply another broken engagement involving people of wealth and position. But I knew that behind those few lines a story of deception, courage, violence, and extraordinary danger. The same newspaper also carried news of Kitty Winter's appearance before the police court. She was charged with throwing vitriol. There could be no question that she had committed the act. The consequences were terrible. The damage to the Baron was permanent. His appearance, once one of his greatest advantages, had been destroyed. The man who had used his charm to influence others now had to live the results of an attack which had left him horribly disfigured. Yet the circumstances surrounding Kitty Winter were taken into account. Her history with the Baron became known. The court heard enough to understand that the attack had not come from an ordinary quarrel. She had been one of the women whose lives had been damaged by him. Her punishment was therefore the lowest possible for such an offense. I could not say that the outcome was entirely satisfying. The law had been broken. Someone had been terribly injured. And yet the woman who had committed the crime had herself been shaped by the cruelty she had suffered. It was one of those situations in which no easy judgment seemed possible. Holmes himself did not attempt to simplify it. He had never been a man who believed that human beings could be divided neatly into good and evil. He understood too well how circumstances could change people. A victim could become dangerous. A respectable gentleman could become a predator. A loving daughter could refuse to believe the truth. And a detective could find himself breaking the very laws he was normally called upon to defend. That last point became particularly amusing after the case. Holmes had, after all, entered the Baron's house without permission. He had removed property that did not belong to him. He had deceived the Baron. And if the authorities had chosen to pursue the matter, he might have found himself answering serious questions. There was even some talk of prosecution, but nothing came of it. The purpose of the burglary, Blairetain, to prevent a terrible marriage. The person who had been protected was innocent. And the circumstances were unusual enough that the law proved rather less rigid than it might ordinarily have been. Holmes was not surprised. He had always understood that machinery of justice was operated by human beings. Human beings, unlike machines, could sometimes understand circumstances. One evening, when we were sitting together at Baker Street, I asked Holmes whether he regretted anything about the affair. He looked at me for several moments before answering. There was no smile upon his face. "No, Watson," he said quietly. The result was muttered. That was typical of him. He did not defend every action. He did not attempt to make himself appear heroic. He simply looked at the result. A young woman had been prevented from marrying a dangerous man. That was the fact which mattered. I thought about that answer for some time. Holmes had always been fascinated by facts, but in this case, the most important fact was not something that could be written into a police report. It was the life that had not been ruined, the tragedy that had not happened, the marriage that had never taken place. There are victories which leave behind bodies and handcuffs. There are other victories which leave nothing visible at all. The best of them may be the ones in which disaster simply fails to occur. That was the kind of victory Holmes achieved. He prevented a future rather than solved a past, and perhaps that explained why the case had affected him so strongly. I also wondered what became of Violet. I never learned all the details. Holmes was not inclined to pursue the private affairs of those he had helped once the danger had passed, but I imagined that her father would keep her close. She had been saved from the Baron, but she had also suffered the shock of discovering that the man she loved was not the man she believed him to be. That kind of wound cannot be treated with medicine. There is no bandage for it. The truth may save a person from danger, but it can also leave pain behind. Perhaps, in time, she recovered. Perhaps she looked back upon the affair and wondered how she could ever have been so completely deceived. Perhaps she remembered the Baron differently. Perhaps she remembered him with anger. Or perhaps, for a long time, she continued to feel something for the man who had once seemed to her so irresistible. Human feelings are not governed by logic. Holmes knew that better than anyone. That was why he had never expected evidence alone to win the battle. He had needed the right evidence. The brown book had evidence. It was the final weapon. The Baron had been able to control his reputation because he controlled the story told about him. He could charm one woman. He could threaten another. He could dismiss accusations. He could manipulate witnesses, but he could not rewrite his own handwriting. The book had preserved his thoughts when he believed that nobody would ever use them against him. In that sense, his own confidence had defeated him. He had been too certain that he would always remain in control. That confidence had caused him to keep records of his private life, and those records had eventually become the instrument of his downfall. I often wondered whether he understood this. Perhaps he did. The Baron was an intelligent man. He must have realized, sooner or later, that the game had been lost. He had believed that Holmes was holding a weak hand. He had even laughed at the detective's attempt to interfere with marriage. He had thought himself protected by Violet's devotion. He had believed that his past could not reach him, but Holmes had understood something that the Baron had missed. The truth does not always need to be stronger than a lie. Sometimes it only needs to survive long enough. The Baron had spent years building his protection. Holmes had needed only one weakness. That weakness was the book, and once Holmes had found it, the entire structure began to collapse. I remember looking back upon the first meeting with our mysterious visitor. At that time, the case had seemed almost impossible. A powerful man wanted Holmes to prevent a marriage. The woman at the center of it loved the man she was being warned against. The client would not reveal his name. The evidence was old. The danger was hidden, and the enemy was fully aware that Holmes was coming. Yet Holmes had accepted the challenge. That was another thing I admired about him. He did not need a case to be easy. Indeed, difficult cases seemed to interest him most. The more complicated the problem, the more alive he became. But there had been something different in his manner during this affair. He had been serious from the beginning. There was no amusement in his work. He understood that a person's future was involved. Perhaps that was why the violence affected him more than usual. When I told him of the Baron's injuries, I had seen a genuine expression of horror upon his face. Holmes could be cold. He could be ruthless, but he was not cruel. He understood the difference between stopping a dangerous man and enjoying his suffering. The sight of the Baron's ruined face had shocked him. And yet Holmes had still believed that the marriage had to be stopped. That was the strange balance within my friend. He could feel sympathy without allowing sympathy to interfere with judgment. He could recognize the humanity of a criminal without forgetting the danger that criminal represented. That was perhaps the quality which made him such a remarkable detective. He saw people clearly, not as they wished to be seen, not as they presented themselves, but as their actions revealed them. The Baron had presented himself as a gentleman. His actions revealed something else. Kitty Winter had presented herself as an angry and dangerous woman. Her history revealed a victim as well. Violet had presented herself as a woman passionately in love. Her situation revealed someone in danger of making a terrible mistake, and the mysterious client had presented himself as a stranger. His actions revealed the loyal friend. Holmes had seen all of this. That was why he had succeeded. The case eventually faded from the newspapers. London found other scandals. Other criminals appeared. Other mysteries occupied the police. And Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet I never entirely forgot the affair. Whenever I passed through the Strand and saw the crowds moving beneath the gas lamps, I sometimes remembered the evening and Holmes and I had discussed the Baron's character. Whenever I saw a beautifully dressed gentleman with a pleasant smile, I remembered that appearances were not always evidence of character. And whenever I thought of the Brown Book, I remembered how dangerous a man's own secrets could become when they were placed in the hands of someone who understood their value. The world often imagines that Sherlock Holmes solved cases through extraordinary observation. That is true. But observation alone was not enough. He understood human weakness. He knew that people lied. He knew that people loved against reason. He knew that criminals trusted their own cleverness. and he knew that pride could be as dangerous as any weapon. The Baron had been defeated partly because of his intelligence. He had believed himself clever enough to control everyone around him. That belief made him careless. He had shown Holmes his confidence. He had revealed that he considered the detective harmless, and when Holmes finally acted, the Baron was not prepared. The most dangerous enemy is sometimes the one who believes he has already won. That lesson stayed with me. As for Holmes, he moved on. There were other cases waiting. Other footsteps would soon climb the stairs of Baker Street. Other strangers would enter our rooms carrying secrets. Other nights would find us sitting beside the fire while London slept outside. And I knew that, sooner or later, another problem would demand my friend's attention. The affair of Baron Gruner would become another story in the long record of our adventures. But it would always seem unusual to me. For once, Holmes had not been trying to discover who had committed a crime. He had been trying to stop crime before it could happen. He had not been seeking punishment. He had been seeking prevention. And in doing so, he had entered a world where logic alone was not enough. He had faced charm, manipulation, obsession, revenge, and love. Above all, he had faced the dangerous ability of one human being to make another believe exactly what he wanted. The final newspaper notice was brief. The marriage would not take place. That was all the public needed to know. But for Holmes and me, the story had been far more complicated. A young woman had stood at the edge of a terrible decision. A dangerous man had nearly secured the future he desired. A wounded victim had sought revenge. A secret client had asked for help. And a detective had stepped into the darkness between them. In the end, the truth had reached the person who needed it. The marriage was broken, the danger was removed, and the case was closed. I remember one final evening, and Holmes sat quietly beside the fire. The lamps had been lowered. The street outside had grown silent. The case had been discussed for the last time. Holmes leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. There was no triumph in his expression, only tiredness. I watched him for a moment. Then I looked toward the darkened window. London was sleeping. Somewhere beyond the glass were thousands of people who knew nothing of what had happened. They did not know about the Baron. They did not know about Kitty Winter. They did not know about the secret book. They did not know how close a young woman had come to disaster. And perhaps that was as it should be. A successful investigation does not always need applause. Sometimes the greatest achievement is simply that tomorrow arrives without the tragedy that might otherwise have occurred. That night, I understood the true meaning of the case. The Illustrious Client had not really asked Sherlock Holmes to destroy a man. He had asked him to save a woman, and Holmes had done exactly that. The rest, the scandal, the violence, the injuries, the secrets, the danger, belonged to the strange path by which the truth had finally reached its destination. The fire burned lower. Holmes remained silent. I closed my notebook. And with that, the strange affair of Baron Adelbert Gruner passed into the growing collection of memories which I have carried from my years beside Sherlock Holmes. It was a case in which appearances deceived everyone, a case in which love blinded the innocent, a case in which evil wore the manners of a gentleman, and a case in which the smallest hidden weakness brought down a man who believed himself untouchable. The truth had been there all along. It had simply been waiting for someone clever enough to uncover it, and once uncovered, it had been impossible to hide. That was the final lesson of the affair. No matter how carefully a person builds a false reputation, there may always be something left behind: a word, a letter, a memory, a record, a secret And sometimes, when the moment comes, that secret can become the very thing that saves an innocent life. So the case ended quietly. No grand public celebration followed. No statue was raised. No crowd gathered outside Baker Street. Only a short newspaper notice announced that the marriage would not take place. But Holmes and I knew what those few words truly meant. A future had changed. A danger had been avoided. And somewhere in London, a young woman was given the chance to begin again. For Sherlock Holmes, that was enough. For me, it was one more reminder that the greatest mysteries are not always about stolen jewels, missing documents, or unexplained deaths. Sometimes the greatest mystery is the human heart itself. And sometimes the most important work a detective can do is not to solve what has already happened, it is to prevent what might happen next. With that thought, the affair of the Illustrious Client came to its quiet end.